So this is going to be our last week in Plato, and for the week as a whole, we'll be in books 9 and 10 of the Republic. However, today I'm going to focus a little bit on book 8 and how it bleeds into 9. Book 8 is a direct predecessor to book 9 in that book 9 directly feeds off the ideas that are presented in book 8. Probably do a little bit of recap of the central concepts in books 6 and 7, so the allegory of the cave, divided line, and all that stuff, so that we're confident moving forward with that. But then we're going to spend our time in books 8 and primarily 9. So backtracking a little bit here, we have 3 central analogies in the text. We have the allegory of the cave, we have the analogy of the sun, and we have the divided line. Beginning with the allegory of the cave, here's our backstory. People are tied up in a chain, they're facing a back wall, and behind them there is a ledge where artifacts are placed on the ledge, and they're illuminated by flame so that the prisoners see the shadow of the artifacts, and the prisoners, they think that this is a real life. Eventually, they get free, and they ascend the cave out into the terrestrial world, and they see that the world is illuminated by the sun, and they see all the world around them. From here, Plato starts to think about what is the obligation of the philosopher kings. This is all analogies about the philosopher kings, our guardians. Plato starts to think, what is their responsibility to those that are still in the cave? And Socrates argues that they are morally obliged to go back into the cave and drag out those that are still bound in chains. So we do have, within the allegory of the cave, we have this question of education as force. There is a role Socrates seems to be flirting with here about the forcefulness of education and bringing people out into the sun regardless of whether they want it or not. Okay, allegory of the sun. The sun is supposed to be, we have a twofold analogy here. We have the sun in the physical realm, which is supposed to be analogous to the form of the good, or in the Greek, to kolon. Remember, the name of our city here is the Kallipolis, or the good city. This word kolon can be translated as good, noble, we translate as beautiful. It would come later in Aristotle. There is a phrase and an idea that Aristotle has called the kolos kagathos, the beautiful or the noble and the good, and he uses this to refer to the upper echelons of society. The idea here being in the Hellenic mind that goodness and beauty and nobility are all tied in together. They're two sides of the same coin. So in the same way that the physical sun illuminates the world around us and is the medium by which we can see things in the world, to kolon, or the good, is supposed to be the medium by which we can understand the world around us. So the sun is how we see the world, or the medium by which we see the world. But to kolon, the good, is the means by which we intellect the world. And note here I use the verb to intellect. Sounds a little clunky, as opposed to know, because this leads us into our last analogy of the divided line. We have I should probably say ontology to be more specific. Our ontology and our epistemology. At the lowest form of epistemology, we have imagination. eikasia, which is related to images. This is what, in the allegory of the cave, the prisoners are viewing on the cave wall. They're viewing eikasia, images of real things. They're not viewing real things. They're viewing merely shadows. Above imagination, we have belief, or doxa, and this relates to visible things. So we have a one-to-one relationship across the divided line between the epistemology and the ontology, in that we are in the relevant epistemic state that correlates to the ontological thing. So we have beliefs regarding visible things. I have beliefs about tables, chairs, peoples, cats, dogs. And I have eikasia, I have imagination regarding images. I don't have beliefs about images. I merely have eikasia. English doesn't make this verbal distinction. This is what Plato's doing here. These combined, so these two make up the visible world. And then above this, going back to our epistemology, we have, we may call it discursive thought. I will often change what I call this, and it's not to be obnoxious. Rather, there's no good word in English that captures the Greek dianoia. It's a compound word of the preposition through, dia, and nous, mind, dianoia, and it means literally thinking through. It's what you do when you do math. You think through the math problem. You think through the relationship between the mathematical objects so that you can reach some conclusion, whatever that may be. And lo and behold, this directly correlates to our ontological object of mathematicals. A fascinating part of Platonic thought. And Plato's committed to this as a result of the allegory of the cave and the divided line. Plato thinks about mathematical objects as real things. He doesn't think of them as abstractions. We, in our contemporary view of philosophy of mathematics, tend to view mathematical objects, as abstractions. Abstractions, and this goes back to Aristotle, they're abstractions in the domain of quantity. But Plato doesn't think this. He doesn't think that mathematicals are abstractions. Rather, he thinks that they are real objects in the most literal sense of the word. They're more real than visible things and images. The number 2 is more real than the Grand Canyon in a very important way for Plato. Above discursive thinking, we have knowledge. Or in the Greek, episteme. And this is why I use the tokolon, the good, is the means by which we intellect the world, not the means by which we know the world. Because to know or knowledge in the Hellenic mind is an honorific. We can only know that which is not subject to change. And for Plato, this is the forms, or in the singular, toedos. Now, thinking very briefly here, let's back up a moment. We have the forms, and then while all forms are supposed to be the means by which we can understand a thing of that particular kind, Plato does seem to have a ranking of the forms, where he thinks that the most important form is tokolon, it's the good. The good is the means by which we understand all other forms. To go into a little history here, as the classical period, which is pre-Alexander the Great, so from Socrates to Alexander the Great, as the classical period comes to a close, we enter in what's called the Hellenistic period. The Hellenistic period of Hellenic philosophy is marked by Alexander the Great till Rome conquers Magna Graeca, so Rome conquers the Hellenic world. And this period here is marked by the emergence of schools. So, for example, Aristotelian thought Aristotle's students, they build what's called the Lyceum, and they give birth to a school called the Peripatetics. This comes from the Greek peripateo, which means, the New Covenant scriptures use peripateo to mean to walk, but literally it means to pace. And they call themselves the Peripatetics. Apparently Aristotle was notorious for pacing during lectures. I understand that. I like to pace. So they call themselves the Peripatetics. Plato, a lot of schools come out of Platonic thought, but one school that comes out of Platonic thought are called the Gnostics. Comes from the Greek word gnosis, which means, not quite, it means to know. It's a similar word, or similar verb to episteme, which is related to episteme, but there are slight differences here. And the Gnostics are, perhaps infamous is better than famous, they're infamous for trying to merge Platonic thought with Christian theology, or with the New Covenant scriptures. And as a result, they come up with a lot of ideas regarding the New Covenant scriptures that are not in the text. And a lot of those ideas still remain today. The reason I bring this up is because you can very easily see how Plato, by talking about the form of the good in this kind of esoteric way as the thing by which all other forms are known, and the thing that which is to illuminate the entire intellectual world, that this very slowly under the Gnostics starts to become associated with God. And we see this in European history and early church history, is this the syncretism between Platonic thought and Jewish thought. And it doesn't go well, because the two just don't go hand in hand. But nevertheless, that becomes the European tradition of the church. Moving on, that was a little fun tangent. Moving on from this, we get into books 8 and 9, which do come as a pair. And we have, the books 8 and 9 go back all the way to book 1, where one of our central questions from book 1 was, is dikaiosune intrinsically or merely instrumentally valuable? So we're trying to think about the axiology of justice, of dikaiosune. Is this the kind of thing that we value for its own sake, or do we value it because of what it gets us? And if you recall in book 1, there's two positions. There's the position of Thrasymachus, and then there's the position of Socrates. Thrasymachus says if dikaiosune is even valuable, he's highly skeptical of the value of dikaiosune, but he says if dikaiosune is to be valuable, then it is only valuable as an instrument. Not following the Thrasymachian arguments, but this later in the Hellenic period comes to be the position of Epicurus. Epicurus, unlike his contemporaries, unlike most of Hellenic thought, will argue that justice is merely of instrumental value. The only reason you should be just is because if you're not just, you're constantly going to be nervous in society. You're constantly going to be worrying about others. But barring that, barring a ring of Gyges kind of situation, like Socrates provides this allegory, barring a ring of Gyges, there's no intrinsic value in being just. We only strive to be just because the social benefits of it. Socrates, by contrast, takes up the position that dikaiosune is intrinsically valuable. And Glaucon and Adamantus, they ask him, why? Why is dikaiosune intrinsically valuable? Explain this. And Socrates punts. He punts this all the way to books 8 and 9. So books 8 through 9 are going to deal, at least in part, with this question all the way from book 1 of why is dikaiosune intrinsically valuable. The reason he punts it as far as he does is we need to establish the tripart division of the suke, or as we translate it, the soul. Once again, not a religious term. We best translate suke as mind. It is the non-physical rational thing that makes us us. And we saw that the 3 parts of our suke are reason, or logos, spirit, or thumos, and appetite. You will often see appetite translated as desire. Greek here is epithumia. Look, you don't have to know Greek to be able to recognize that there is an etymological link between thumos and epithumia. This is of no mistake. There is a link here. Thumos, if you're a little bit clever, look at Thrasymachus' name. His name in Greek here is Thrasumachos. It's a compound word between thumos and mache. Thumos, as we've seen, means spirits, or like bravado or zeal. Mache is the Greek word for battle. Thrasumachos, his name literally means, Thrasymachus' name literally means spirited in battle. And names in Platonic dialogues play a key portion in understanding the character, in understanding the positions they'll take, how clever they are, and their ability to engage with Socrates. So we already know the Greek reader, by seeing the name Thrasumachos, already knows that Thrasymachus is going to be kind of like a wild animal. He's going to be brash. He's going to be brazen in the way he approaches dialectic, which we see very clearly in Book 1. But note, we never hear from Thrasymachus again after Book 1. But back to the main content. So we have this tripartite division of the suke between logos, thumos, and epithumia. And Socrates is in Book 8, so focusing here on Book 8, is going to link this up to different kinds of constitutions. This is Book 8 and 9. He's going to link it up to different kinds of constitutions and different kind of people. And the rankings of different kinds of people is going to have everything to do with the proper ordering of the suke. So remember, we first built the Callipolis in our conceptual space so that we can identify what dikaiosune is in the suke. There's a good question here of to what degree is Socrates or Plato genuinely interested in political philosophy. It's not overly clear. I take it he is. As a historical anecdote, he attempted to institute this on an island in the Aegean Sea. Didn't go very well. Got run out of town. But the central focus is trying to understand the soul. He's trying to understand the human mind. And toward that end, Socrates is going to identify several constitutions or several ways to structure a society, and he's going to rank them from best to worst. So our best society, as instantiated by the Callipolis, is an aristocracy. Now don't get hung up on this word. This word aristocracy has a lot of really bad connotations. We think aristocracy, and we start to think about European history. We start to think about 18th century Europe and a bunch of rich people running everything. Well, this is not the case. This is not a genuine aristocracy in the Platonic sense of the word. An aristocracy is rule of the best, or in this case, rule of the philosopher kings. Why? Because they are the ones who possess what is required to lead. Under this is what is called a timocracy. A timocracy comes from the Greek word time and kratos, and it's the rule of honor. Okay? Socrates points out a real-world timocracy for his time period. And to identify a timocracy, he points out Lacedaemonium, or what you probably are more commonly referred to as Sparta. Sparta is an instantiation, Plato thinks, of a timocracy. A timocracy overruled by honor, in Plato's mind, is a polis that instead of reason being in charge, instead of logos being in charge, thumos is in charge. Now, make no mistake, these different parts of the suke, they get gold, silver, and bronze medals. Reason is the best. Thumos is second best. Appetite is the worst. And a timocracy, a state where spirit rules the state, is one where it's pretty good. Thumos doesn't do a bad job. It's still not harmonious because it's not being led by logos, but it could be a lot worse. So Plato is going to place much more value in a timocracy than the other city-states that follow. Less than a timocracy is an oligarchy. Comes from the Greek, oligos, and arche. Arche means rule or beginning, oligos means few, and an oligarchy is a rule of the few. More properly put, what we saw in 18th century and 19th century Europe, in feudal Europe, even earlier than the 19th and 18th centuries, going all the way back to feudal Europe, is more properly an oligarchy than it is an aristocracy. Because it's not the rule of the best people, rather it was a rule of few people. Okay? And the issue that Plato sees with oligarchies is that they kind of mimic an aristocracy in that a small subset of the population is the one that's in charge. However, it is not as good as an aristocracy because it's not the right people in charge. If you recall, going back to the suke and to the polis, reason has its characteristic virtue, which is wisdom. Spirit has its characteristic virtue, which is courage. But then the city-state as a whole has their own respective virtues. You have temperance, and you have justice, sophrosune and dikaiosune, respectively. And these are virtues that supervene over the well-structured state. That is, you only get temperance and justice in a state when not only is it ordered in this way, with logos using thumos to control epithumia, not only is this you get this when it's ordered in this way, but it wants to be ordered in this way. That the people of the Kallipolis recognize the goodness, the inherent goodness of this structure. So in an oligarchy, which mimics an aristocracy in that there's few people in charge, you don't have the supervening virtues of temperance and justice. Why? Because just because a few people are in charge doesn't mean that they're the right people. Lower than an oligarchy, this is going to be, to the contemporary Western liberal reader, this comes always as a surprise because we laud this as the pinnacle of governance. But in Plato's mind, this is second worst type of governance, and it's a democracy. Or the Greek, comes from the Greek demos, which means people, kind of like the people, and kratos, or power of the people. Plato thinks that democracies are really bad social arrangements. And to point toward a democracy, he gives his own hometown. He points to Athens. Look at this. This is you have to understand the time period a little bit to understand this, to appreciate this. But this is bold. Because coming out of this time period, so Socrates would have fought in it, not Plato. You had what was called the Peloponnesian War. The Peloponnesian War was a multi-decade war. It wasn't constant fighting. There's periods on and off. A multi-decade war between Athens and Sparta. And it was a war in many ways over who would control and who would be the top dog in the Peloponnese, or in that peninsula of southern Greece and all the surrounding islands. Athens was known for its naval prowess, and Sparta was known for its armies. And through skirmishes across the Peloponnese and through the use of vassal states, Athens and Sparta are going to go at one another for decades. If you ever get interested, go read Thucydides, History of the Peloponnesian War. Thucydides is an Athenian general who gets exiled, and he writes what in many ways becomes the first history book because he tries to present history in an objective fashion. This is an anomaly for the time period. History was not seen as an objective discipline. It was seen as storytelling. So history very much was understood to have bias, whereas Thucydides tries to avoid that. And in this conflict between Sparta and Athens, eventually Athens, well, there's a lot of back and forth, but in the end, Athens kind of wins. And Athens is what we think of now when we think of Greek culture. We think of Athenian democracy, Athenian art. But Thucydides himself says that the Spartans are by far more advanced. They are the better society, but he says no one will remember the Spartans because they don't build anything. Whereas the Athenians love to build things. And the problem that Plato is going to have with a democracy, so he's taking issue with his hometown social arrangement, and he's going to say this is a bad social arrangement, democracy, is that everyone does what they want. And in a city-state where everyone does what they want, no one is in charge. He very much gets democracy right. In the US, we don't have a democracy, we have a republic. The Romans took democracy and imposed some structure, some order on it, a system to govern more efficiently. But in the Hellenic democracy, it was very much one man, very specifically one man, one vote. And Everything from taxation to the building of ships, the sacrifices to do we go to war is voted on by the people. And throughout Platonic literature, Plato is opposed to this system of governance. Why? Because not everyone is an expert. Don't go asking me on should we build another public statue. I have no idea how you even begin assessing that. Don't ask me, don't try to vote me in as a general. I don't know how to be a general. But this is how democracy in the Hellenic period was done. People would run for general, and they were voted in by the majority. And Plato's saying to the reader, this is a terrible idea. You need expertise. Think about when we built the city of pigs back in Book 2 of the Republic. The shining virtue of the city of swine was that everyone was an expert. One person made the shoes. One person grew the barley. One person made the wine. And as a result, they're able to develop expertise in that craft. Plato will always be an advocate of specialization over being a jack of all trades. And the issue with the democracy is by placing everyone in charge, you have mayhem. No one's in charge. And he thinks that all democracies eventually devolve into a tyranny. The Greek word here is tyrannos. It's where we get our word tyrant, tyrannos. And it means exactly what you think it means. It just means tyrant. Democracy, Plato thinks, is doomed to devolve into a tyranny. Why? Because with no one actually being in charge, with no strong leadership, no temperance and justice and a proper arrangement of the city-state, all you need is one person with enough charisma, enough zeal, and a big enough stick to come around and take all the power for him or herself. And we saw that in Hellenic history. Athens was plagued by tyrants during the Peloponnesian War. Every couple of years, every 5 to 10 years, a new tyrant would arise in Athens. Some of them were half decent, like Pericles. Others were utter nightmares. But what Plato is trying to argue here is that democracy is doomed to devolve into tyranny because there is no structure. Because the structure of the city-state is not the way it should be, there is no hierarchical system, you've opened up the floodgates. You've opened up Pandora's box where things can devolve very, very quickly. And as we'll see next time, what Socrates is going to do is he's going to take these 5 forms of management of the state, so the aristocracy, the timocracy, oligarchy, democracy, and tyranny. He's going to take them and move from discussing constitutions to discussing people. And he's going to say there's a one-to-one correlation between these kinds of constitutions and these kinds of people. The person, so mimicking the aristocracy, is the philosopher king. This person is properly ordered. They are properly structured in this way, with reason or logos using thumos to control epithumia. And as we'll see tomorrow, this person experiences genuine pleasure. Not what Socrates would call illusory pleasures, which are predicated upon pain. Plato's going to use hunger as an example. The pleasure associated with eating food only can occur due to the pain associated with being hungry. And he's going to think of these as a lesser kind of pleasure. But he's going to think of the pleasure that the philosopher king experiences as genuine pleasure because they're not predicated on privation. Related to the democracy is the spirited person. This is your Alexander the Great. Someone who, there's still order within their suke, but it's not the proper order. Instead of logos leading, it's thumos. And as a result, they do dumb things. Like, realistically, Alexander chasing after Cyrus. Or Alexander doing half the things that Alexander did. Oligarchy, he's going to relate this to the oligarchical person. The person who hoards wealth. The person, he's very much going to think of this in terms of money. This is the person who hoards their wealth. And they don't know how to be properly liberal with their wealth. The democracy, he's going to relate to the democratic person. And he thinks that this person, we'll discuss this in more detail tomorrow, because he's a fascinating person. It's fascinating because I take it this is what most people aspire to be in contemporary Western society. But Plato says this is a terrible kind of person to be. Democracy, he's going to equate to the person who has too much liberty. That is, they have too much free time, and they have too many options. He's going to use an analogy of it's kind of like a patchwork quilt. It's kind of like a patchwork quilt in that there's no real rhyme or reason. And because this person lacks any sort of structure, any sort of leading faculty, they kind of just get pulled in every which direction. It's funny that he thinks that this is a dangerous place to be, this democratic person, because as we go forward in European history, entering into like the Belle Epoque, or the beautiful epic in French history, thinking like the 18th century, 19th century, this is exactly what Western Europeans, predominantly the French, but we saw it with the English as well, this is exactly what they aspired to be. They aspire to be libertines. They aspire to have all their indulgences and be able to indulge this fancy and that fancy and to do as one wishes. In many ways, this is what we still aspire to in liberal Western society. People want, I take it the main reason people want money is so that they don't have to work, so that they can then indulge their fancies, so that they can, I don't know, do art in the morning, go to the gym in the afternoon, and then pick up cooking classes in the evening. So what people aspire to is to do all different kinds of things. But Plato is going to argue this is a really bad idea, because the more liberty, we'll talk about what liberty means tomorrow, the more liberty you allow yourself and the less structure you impose upon life, the easier it is for you to devolve into tyranny. And the tyrant, tyranny is going to be equated with the tyrant as far as individual constitutions, with regard to the suke. And Plato is going to think of the tyrant as being led solely by epithumia. This person is led completely by their appetites and their desires, and as a result, they live a life of fear because they are worried about having the object of their desire taken from them, or they're worried about not being able to satisfy the object of their desire. So, for example, think about a drunk. The drunk's biggest fear is not being able to find a drink. The drug addict's biggest fear is not knowing if they're going to be able to get their next hit. And this is how Plato is thinking about the tyrant. They're led solely by epithumia, they're led solely by their desires, and as a result, their life is actually chaos and fearful. By contrast, the philosopher king, their life is completely just. Their life is led by reason, and as such, they experience genuine pleasure, not these illusory pleasures of the tyrant. This should very much bring back Aristotle's discussion of the same exact ideas, same exact concepts. Because Aristotle, like Plato, thinks that democracy is a terrible social arrangement. Aristotle, like Plato, is going to think that an aristocracy is a much better social arrangement. Why? Because there is structure. Now, to appeal to the Western liberal mind, contemporary Western liberal mind, we say, okay, structure sounds great, but think about everything we read in the Republic. Think about the educational plans of the auxiliaries, the philakoi, the educational plans of the guardians. There's propaganda, there's force, there's compulsion. We then need to wonder whether or not the benefits of structure outweigh all these things. Is having structure and instantiating these four virtues, is that worth the propaganda, the censorship, the compulsion that we see in the Callipolis? But I leave that up to you to think about. We're going to pause there. Tomorrow we will discuss the rest of book 8 and book 9, and then after that we'll go on to book 10.